In the cafeteria of a Boston elementary school, amid the smell of carton milk and the clang of metal trays, a 6-year-old girl opened her faded pink lunchbox. Inside there was no sandwich, no apple, no snack. Only a crumpled note, edges curled from the dampness of her small hands. "I'm sorry. There's no food today. Love, Mom." At the doorway, a tall man in a dark wool coat stopped as though his polished shoes had slipped on a patch of invisible ice. Jonathan Blake, billionaire investor, master of mergers, the man whose signature could collapse or revive entire companies, stared at the note, and for the first time in years felt the world inside his chest tilt. The numbers, forecasts, and balance sheets that normally ran through his mind like a ticker tape fell silent. The cafeteria was noisy, laughter, shouting, trays scraping across plastic tables. Yet in that instant, it seemed as if the world pressed a finger to its lips. Jonathan had not come here to be moved. His visit was part of a public relations routine. Field engagement, his team called it. His conglomerate owned shares in the company supplying meals to several schools in the state. His assistant had arranged the schedule, the chauffeur had opened the car door, and the cafeteria manager had greeted him with a stiff handshake. Everything was supposed to be predictable. Walk through, nod politely, perhaps pose for a picture, then leave. Nothing about it was meant to crack the surface of his carefully contained life. And yet, a single lunchbox had done just that. Under the fluorescent lights, the plastic lid reflected ghostly white blotches. Once bright with painted sunflowers, it was now faded from countless hurried washes. The little girl, someone had called her Emily, smoothed the note gently with both hands, as though folding a flag. She placed it carefully back inside, neither hiding it nor showing it off. Then she glanced at her classmates, who were busy unwrapping sandwiches and pizza squares. In her brown eyes there was no bitterness, only a strange, serene acceptance, the kind children often have toward rain. It rains, you get wet. That's all. Jonathan was used to walnut wood tables stretching endlessly, to crystal glasses clinking with a sound as sharp as breaking ice. In those rooms, people spoke of cost optimization and break-even points with the same casual tone others used for weather. But here, across a crowded cafeteria, all those phrases suddenly seemed clumsy, almost obscene. He tried to reason with himself. Perhaps the girl had simply forgotten her lunch. Perhaps her mother had been busy. But the ink on the note was too fresh, the words too hurried. "I'll try again tomorrow. Love, Mom." It carried the smell of overtime shifts, of suppressed coughs, of alarm clocks that ring before dawn in rooms without sunlight. A cafeteria employee noticed Jonathan's pause and smiled politely. "Mr. Blake, would you like to see the kitchen?" He nodded automatically. They walked him past stainless steel counters and refrigerators, explaining regulations and supply chains. Jonathan listened. But their words slid past like ticker headlines on a news channel, visible but weightless. His eyes kept drifting back toward the far corner where Emily sat. She had opened the lunchbox again, as if hoping a miracle had slipped inside when she wasn't looking. But there was no miracle, only silence and the laughter of other children crunching cookies and apples. The unease in Jonathan's chest irritated him. He disliked what he could not control. At 45, he had designed his life the way he optimized a portfolio. Fixed wake-up times, fixed running routes, the same coffee beans delivered weekly, the same commute, the same newspapers read in the same order. People called it discipline. He knew it was also a fortress. He had not looked beyond its walls in years, until now, when a scrap of paper pierced through them. "Would you like to try the macaroni and cheese today? It's quite good," the manager suggested. Jonathan shook his head. He signed a form to confirm his visit, his signature quick and efficient, then paused as he looked at it. Jonathan Blake. 2 words that functioned like an automatic door. Open, shut, never revealing who stood behind. From the corner of his eye, he saw Emily improvise. She pulled a bent straw from her pocket and pretended to sip from an invisible milk carton. She even closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the flavor of nothing. Then, with theatrical care, she divided the air in her lunchbox lid into neat quarters, as if sharing soup with herself. There was pride in the gesture, not the kind that defies pity, but the kind that insists, this too is a meal. This too is mine. A boy at the next table noticed and snickered. "Hey, eating air?" His laughter was sharp, thoughtless, like most children's. Emily did not cry. She lifted her chin a fraction and nodded slightly as if to say, yes. And still, it is mine. Jonathan almost ordered someone to bring her food. A single command and trays would appear. Milk, mac and cheese, apples. But something inside warned him, don't. A gift in front of so many eyes would turn a quiet dignity into a loud humiliation. The only hunger it would satisfy would be his own need to feel noble. So he stood still. And in that stillness, he felt himself learning, like a novice watching a silent teacher. He was learning how to look at a child facing emptiness without flinching, without trying to erase it with money, without hiding it behind words. The lunch bell rang, a thin sound that stretched across brick walls like a taut wire. Children lined up, chatter flowing like a stream. Emily packed her things carefully, note inside, lid closed, latch clicked. She hugged the box to her chest and scurried into line, her worn sneakers brushing the tiles like small boats over water. Only when her figure disappeared through the doors did Jonathan remember his phone. 3 missed calls from his assistant, each punctuated by urgent messages. He listened to half of one, then shut it off. His fingertips felt cold. The familiar words, profit margins, growth, EBITDA, tried to crowd back in, but now they sounded like a train rushing past a bridge, while something precious slipped into the river below. "Shall we continue the tour?" the manager asked. Jonathan forced a polite smile. "No, thank you. I've seen enough." He signed another paper, then, almost against his will, turned back for one last glance at the table where Emily had sat. Nothing remained there but a patch of sunlight on plastic, as though someone had pulled back a curtain for the sky to lean in. Outside, Boston's late autumn air cut sharper than before. A maple tree in the courtyard dropped its crimson leaves like unanswered letters. The chauffeur opened the door of a black sedan. Jonathan slid in, sealing himself back inside leather and silence. He leaned his head against the seat but did not close his eyes. The note returned to him, etched across his vision. "I'm sorry there's no food today. Love, Mom." A single sentence carrying 2 truths, apology and love, braided so tightly they could not be separated. He tried to imagine the woman writing it, sitting at the edge of a bed, hand trembling from fatigue, watching her daughter sleep. When she wrote "Love, Mom," perhaps she smiled. Only love could make someone confess a lack without shame. The car moved through city streets, past red brick walls and green-gray roofs that blurred like hurried pages of a book. Jonathan felt hungry, though not in his stomach. The hunger was lodged in his shoulders where briefcases pressed, in his collarbone where ties tightened, beneath his sternum where signatures weighed like stones. It was a hunger no steak or caviar could fill. A hunger children still recognized, but men like him had taught themselves to forget. "Back to the office, sir?" the driver asked. "Not yet," Jonathan said. "Drive slowly." He did not know where he wanted to go. He only knew he did not want to hurry. For the first time in years, he let the city pass without racing it. On his lap lay his fountain pen. He turned it in his hand, then set it down. Vaguely, like a sailor glimpsing a lighthouse through fog, he sensed that tomorrow and the day after would bring endless demands. But something small had happened today, and if he let it slip, the emptiness inside him would widen. He did not yet know what action he must take. Only that sometimes a promise is born without words, in the silence where a man watches a child drink imaginary soup. He lowered the window an inch. Cold air swept in with the smell of wet leaves. Above the skyline stretched a thin sky, fragile as paper. Jonathan told himself, not aloud, but firmly, that he would return tomorrow. Not to pose, not to donate, not to soothe his own conscience. He would return simply to sit near a lunchbox and to see if, from that small place, the world might be rearranged. The sedan turned onto the avenue, blending into traffic. On a billboard flashed his own face, captured for a business magazine. Blue eyes, practiced smile, the look of a man who had everything. Jonathan glanced at it and finally understood why people believed he was happy. A smile can hide anything, but the hidden things do not vanish. In the rearview mirror, the maple trees of the schoolyard shrank to a thin line. Beyond that line remained an empty lunchbox, and a truth too full to be ignored. Boston chilled by a single degree. And in the heart of a man long armored, the cold felt different. Not an enemy, but a doorway. A doorway large enough for a promise to take root. Jonathan Blake knew then. He had left the cafeteria, but the lunchbox had not left him. It stayed, silent and insistent, like a key waiting for someone to finally fit it into the lock of his own life. Jonathan Blake's life looked, from the outside, like an uninterrupted climb toward a summit so high it pierced the clouds. 45 years old, CEO of a sprawling investment empire headquartered in New York, he lived among skyscrapers and private jets, glass boardrooms and estates so large they swallowed silence whole. He was, to the newspapers, the architect of modern efficiency, a man who dismantled and rebuilt industries with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a shark. But inside, Jonathan was hollow. The limousine that carried him back from Boston that afternoon slid along the highway like a bullet sheathed in black metal. He sat alone in the back seat, staring at the tinted glass, watching the city pass in quick, blurred images. No sound came from the phone buzzing on the leather beside him. He had silenced it. The world outside was urgent. Inside, he was mute. A childhood without anchors had taught him to equate survival with distance. His father had left before Jonathan could remember the color of his eyes. His mother had worked 2 jobs until she disappeared behind the gray curtain of exhaustion, dying young. Jonathan's answer to all that chaos had been walls, discipline, ambition, control. Build the fortress tall enough, he told himself, and hunger cannot enter. Build the accounts large enough, and grief cannot speak. And so he had built. The fortress stood now in the form of 2 estates, one in Manhattan, an apartment with ceilings so high sound vanished before echoing, one in Greenwich, a mansion with a staff that moved silently like ghosts. There were paintings on the walls, yes, but they were investments first, art second. Even beauty had to yield to the ledger. Yet the moment he returned home that evening, the emptiness struck him harder than usual. He entered the foyer, greeted by polished marble and a sweeping staircase. The air smelled faintly of lilies, arranged by staff who thought it appropriate for autumn. He shrugged off his coat, handed it to the butler, and walked into the dining room. A long table waited with 3 place settings, though only one had ever been used. He sat, stared at the food arranged like a magazine spread, seared duck, roasted potatoes, a Bordeaux older than he was, and suddenly thought of a pink lunchbox. A child pretending to eat soup made of air. Jonathan lifted his fork, but it shook slightly in his hand. He set it down. He could not explain why. He only knew the food in front of him, real and abundant, tasted like cardboard even before it touched his lips. Later in his study, he tried to distract himself with numbers. Reports glowed across 3 monitors: quarterly earnings, investment opportunities, forecasts, the kind of documents that once thrilled him. Now the graphs, rising like obedient mountains, looked meaningless. He minimized the windows, leaving the screen black. His own reflection stared back, stern and unfamiliar. He whispered aloud, surprising himself. Empty. The word filled the room more heavily than the silence had. He leaned back in his leather chair, eyes drifting toward the shelves lined with biographies of great men, industrialists, presidents, generals. They had all been his models once, men who bent history with iron will. Yet tonight, the faces on the spines looked less like companions and more like judges. You chased power, yes. But what did you feed? What did you heal? Jonathan rubbed his temples. Perhaps it was exhaustion. He had been flying between continents for weeks, negotiating, acquiring, cutting. Fatigue could play tricks on the mind. That must be it, he reasoned. But no rationalization removed the image of Emily Rivera pressing her lips to a bent straw and pretending it was milk. He had felt the crack in himself then, and it widened now. Around midnight, he wandered through the house. In the grand hallway, portraits of ancestors and purchased art stared down with indifferent eyes. He switched on no lights, preferring the dim glow from the moon through tall windows. His footsteps echoed like someone else's. The vastness mocked him. In the kitchen, he opened the refrigerator, overflowing with imported cheeses, fruits flown in from tropical countries, expensive wines. He closed it again. None of it answered the hunger. For a moment he considered calling someone, a colleague, an acquaintance, even one of the assistants who always spoke in clipped, efficient tones. But he realized he had no one he wanted to call. His phone was full of names, yet empty of voices. His empire, vast as it was, had not given him a single person to whom he could confess. I saw a child today who broke me with an empty lunchbox. He poured himself a drink instead. The amber liquid swirled, caught the light. He lifted the glass, held it up as if toasting the shadows. To emptiness, he murmured, and swallowed. But the warmth in his chest could not fill what was missing. Later, lying in bed, the sheets cool and crisp around him, Jonathan stared at the ceiling. Sleep did not come. He kept seeing the cafeteria, its chaos, its laughter, and that corner table where a girl unfolded dignity out of nothing. He tried to imagine her home, her mother, the weight behind the note. He realized with a jolt of unease that he wanted to know. Not for business, not for charity, but for something else entirely, something that frightened him because he could not name it. The city outside moved on. Traffic pulsed, markets shifted, fortunes rose and fell. But inside Jonathan Blake's world, time slowed to the pace of a child chewing imaginary bread. He turned on his side, exhaled, and admitted the truth to himself. The emptiness he had seen in that lunchbox mirrored his own. A child filled hers with imagination. A man filled his with wealth. Both were still hungry. And in that realization, Jonathan felt something stir. Not comfort, not yet, but the faintest shape of longing. He did not know for what. Not yet. But he knew the fortress he had built was no longer enough. And as the first gray of dawn crept across the Manhattan skyline, Jonathan Blake understood. The world might still call him powerful, ruthless, unshakable. But he was, in truth, an empty man. The next day, against every instinct he had trained into himself, Jonathan Blake returned to the elementary school. He told no one. No assistant scheduled it. No driver prepared the route. No PR staff hovered nearby with cameras. He simply stepped out of his Manhattan office at noon, flagged a car, and gave the driver the school's address. The driver blinked in surprise. Rare was the billionaire who rode in an ordinary cab, but Jonathan needed anonymity. Needed to arrive without the scaffolding of his empire. The cafeteria smelled the same: ketchup, milk cartons, reheated pizza. But today, Jonathan did not walk straight to the kitchen for a tour. He scanned the crowded tables until he found the corner. Emily sat there again, her pink lunchbox resting on the table like an old friend. Around her swirled the chaos of children, but she had created her own world, as children do. An island of imagination. Jonathan hesitated, feeling ridiculous. He was a man who negotiated billion-dollar contracts, who stared down hostile boards and won. Yet he found his palms sweating at the thought of walking toward a 6-year-old girl. Emily flipped open her lunchbox. It was again empty of food, but she was not defeated. Today, she had prepared a new game. She placed a paper napkin across her lap, lifted an invisible fork, and began to serve herself a meal no one else could see. Her lips curved into a secretive smile. Jonathan cleared his throat softly and stepped forward. "Excuse me," he said, his voice unusually low. "Is this seat taken?" Emily looked up, puzzled, then shrugged. "It's my restaurant," she announced with solemn pride. "But you can be a customer if you want." Something inside Jonathan broke and mended in the same second. He pulled out the tiny plastic chair. It creaked under his tall frame, and sat. "What's on the menu today?" he asked. Emily grinned, the shyness in her melting into performance. "Spaghetti, and soup, and chocolate cake. But you have to wait your turn. The chef is busy." She scooped invisible noodles into his imaginary plate and slid it across the table. "Don't spill it." Jonathan leaned forward, lifted the air with care, and mimed eating. He even made the faintest slurping sound. Emily laughed, clapping her hands, delighted by his commitment. For a few minutes, the cafeteria dissolved. There were no bankers, no mergers, no quarterly earnings, only a girl serving invisible food and a man eating it as though it were real. Jonathan realized he had not laughed with such freedom in decades. The sound startled him. It felt raw, almost unfamiliar. He glanced around and saw a few teachers watching, whispering, clearly astonished that this man, whose name filled business headlines, was bent over a table eating pretend spaghetti from an empty lunchbox. But he did not care. "Would you like dessert?" Emily asked, her tone serious, like a proper waitress. "Yes," Jonathan replied. "I've had a very long day." She pretended to place a slice of chocolate cake in front of him. Jonathan raised his fork again, savoring it. "Delicious," he declared. Emily leaned in, whispering, "It's the secret recipe. My mom taught me." At those words, Jonathan froze. Her mom. The note. The empty promise wrapped in love. The smile on Emily's face dimmed slightly, as though she had noticed the shadow crossing his. She tilted her head. "You don't look happy, customer." Jonathan forced a smile back. "No, I am. This is the best chocolate cake I've ever had." Emily studied him, wise beyond her years. "You must be lonely," she said quietly, as if reading his soul the way she read the cracks in her lunchbox. Jonathan opened his mouth, then shut it. No one, not board members, not analysts, not acquaintances in expensive suits, had ever said that to his face. And here was a 6-year-old, offering it as simply as stating the sky was blue. He wanted to deny it, to deflect with a businessman's charm. But he could not. His throat closed. Instead, he bowed his head slightly. "Maybe," he admitted. Emily nodded, satisfied with the honesty. She lifted her straw and drank from the air. "It's okay. If you eat here, you won't be lonely." Jonathan felt his eyes burn. He blinked rapidly. unwilling to let tears betray him in front of children. But the truth was too sharp. A child had offered him what no empire of wealth had managed: belonging. The bell rang, scattering children like a flock of sparrows. Emily snapped her lunchbox shut with a click, tucked it under her arm, and stood. "Thanks for coming," she said, polite as any hostess. Jonathan stood too. For a moment he considered reaching into his wallet, offering her money, a gift, something tangible. But instinct stopped him. That would ruin the fragile dignity of the moment. He could not buy his way into this world. Instead, he bent down, so his eyes were level with hers. "Thank you for the meal," he said gravely. Emily's smile widened, toothy and triumphant. "Come back tomorrow. We'll have pizza." She skipped off, disappearing into the tide of students. Jonathan remained standing there, frozen, the words echoing inside him. Come back tomorrow. A simple invitation. Yet it felt more binding, more real than any contract he had ever signed. That evening, Jonathan returned to his apartment in Manhattan, but the loneliness was louder than usual. The long dining table, the untouched wine, the silent staff, all of it mocked him. He sat in his study, stared at reports, and found them meaningless. All he could think about was a pink lunchbox, an imaginary restaurant, and a promise: come back tomorrow. He realized, with a kind of terror, that he wanted to keep it. Jonathan Blake had not planned to cross into Emily's private world a second time, and yet the following afternoon he found himself outside a weather-beaten apartment building in the outskirts of Boston. The car he had taken from the city had left him on a narrow street where autumn leaves collected like rust against broken sidewalks. The building's paint peeled in long strips, and one of the windows was sealed with cardboard. It was a neighborhood his empire had never touched, except in charts labeled disposable assets. Jonathan hesitated at the steps. A billionaire at the door of poverty, he looked absurd even to himself. But the image of the lunchbox and the invisible chocolate cake had followed him all night, and when he traced that image backward, it always ended here, with the mother who had written the note. He knocked. The door opened after a pause. A woman stood there, thin, pale, her dark hair tied loosely at the back. She looked younger than she was, but illness and exhaustion had sharpened her features into angles. This must be Isabel Rivera. "Yes?" Her voice carried suspicion. She was protective, and Jonathan, in his tailored coat, did not belong. He realized names meant nothing here. Jonathan Blake was a currency of a different world. "I met your daughter at school." At the mention of Emily, Isabel's eyes softened, though only slightly. "Is she all right?" "Yes," Jonathan said quickly. "She's wonderful." The word felt inadequate. Isabel allowed him inside reluctantly. The apartment was small, 2 rooms carved from a larger one. The walls bore the damp stains of a leaky roof. A single lamp filled the space with weak light. Yet on the table lay a drawing, a crayon picture of a little girl, a woman, and, Jonathan froze, a tall man in a suit, seated at a table. Him. He pointed, his throat tight. "She drew this?" Isabel's lips pressed together. "She has a big imagination. She says you came to her restaurant." Jonathan gave a broken laugh. "She served me spaghetti and chocolate cake." "She does that when she's hungry," Isabel murmured, glancing away as if ashamed. Silence settled between them, heavy and fragile. Jonathan searched for words, but Isabel spoke first. "You don't need to be here, Mr. Blake." She had recognized him after all. Her voice was firm now, edged with resentment. "We don't need charity, we just need work." Jonathan flinched. "Work?" Her eyes flashed. I was a seamstress at Colfax Textiles. The factory closed after your company bought it. Overnight, hundreds of us lost our jobs. That's why there's no food in her box. That's why she eats air." The accusation landed like a hammer. Jonathan had known of the acquisition, of course. He had even approved the closure. The decision was presented to him as a matter of efficiency. Shut down outdated plants, outsource production, maximize profit. He had signed without hesitation. And here, in this damp apartment, the consequences had a face. For a moment he could not breathe. "I didn't—" He stopped. Excuses would sound obscene. "I didn't know it was you." Isabel gave a humorless laugh. "Of course you didn't. People like you never know who we are. We're just numbers on a report." Her voice cracked, but she held her ground. There was dignity in her defiance. The same dignity Emily showed while pretending to drink invisible soup. Jonathan wanted to reach for his wallet, to offer money, but the thought withered before it formed. Isabel would never accept it, and he would despise himself for offering. "I'm sorry," he whispered, and meant it more deeply than he had ever meant those words before. Isabel's gaze softened for a fleeting instant, then hardened again. "Apologies don't buy groceries." In the corner, Emily stirred from a nap on the couch, her hair tousled. She blinked, saw Jonathan, and smiled sleepily. "You came back," she said, as if the universe had simply fulfilled a promise. Jonathan crouched down. "I told you I would." She held out another drawing she had made before sleeping. This one showed 3 figures around a table, but the plates were full this time. "This is dinner," she explained. "You'll come too." The innocence of the invitation struck Jonathan harder than any boardroom confrontation ever had. He nodded, unable to speak. Emily climbed onto his knee without hesitation, as though sensing something in him no one else had. A man who had spent too long starving in a palace. She patted his shoulder and said, "Don't worry. Mom makes the best soup. You'll like it." Jonathan glanced at Isabel. Her eyes, though tired, were luminous with a mixture of pride and despair. She said nothing, but her silence spoke. Do not hurt her with promises you cannot keep. He understood. When he finally left, the evening air pressed against him like judgment. He walked down the cracked sidewalk, past flickering streetlights, past children playing with a dented soccer ball. His phone buzzed again, urgent with business. He let it ring. At the corner, he stopped, turned, and looked up at the window of the Rivera apartment. He thought of Isabel's words. "We don't need charity. We need work." He thought of Emily's smile, the drawings, the hope she poured into empty boxes. And for the first time in his career, Jonathan Blake, the man who prided himself on never allowing sentiment to interfere with profit, felt the lines of his life shift. It was not a question of if he would return, but how. Jonathan Blake had always believed promises were dangerous. In business, a promise was a liability, a handcuff that could strangle negotiations, a word that turned fluid possibilities into rigid obligations. He had trained himself to speak in terms of contingencies and probabilities, never certainties. Yet here, in a cramped Boston apartment with peeling paint and flickering light, he found himself teetering on the edge of one. Emily Rivera held up a crayon drawing, her eyes glowing with the fierce joy of a child who believes in her own imagination. The picture was simple. 3 people at a small round table, bowls steaming with food, a sunflower in the center. A little girl with brown pigtails sat on one side, a woman with long dark hair on the other, and between them a tall figure in a suit. Above the table, Emily had written, in crooked letters, "Family Dinner." She thrust the paper into Jonathan's hands. "That's you," she explained, pointing to the suited figure. "You're coming to dinner with us, right, Mom?" Isabel froze, her lips parting. caught between laughter and protest. "Emily," she began softly, but her daughter's earnest eyes silenced her. Jonathan stared at the drawing. His throat tightened. In it, he saw more than colors. He saw the hunger of a child, not only for food, but for a complete table, for the wholeness life had denied her. He looked up at Emily. "And what will we eat?" he asked gently, buying time. Emily beamed. "Soup and bread, and maybe pie if Mom finds apples at the market." She turned to her mother. "We can, right?" Isabel's voice was weary but steady. "We'll see, cariño." Jonathan should have stopped there. He should have smiled, thanked Emily, and folded the drawing carefully before leaving. But the force of her hope was like a tide, pulling him into waters he had no business entering. He heard himself say, in a voice both foreign and inevitable, "Yes, I'll come." The words hung in the air, a dangerous promise. Emily squealed, bouncing on her toes. She ran to the kitchen corner and began rattling through drawers, planning the meal as though it were already real. Isabel turned sharply toward Jonathan, her eyes narrowing. "Why did you say that?" she demanded under her breath. "Because she asked," he replied simply. "She's a child," Isabel snapped. "Children ask for the moon. You can't give it to them." Jonathan met her gaze. "Maybe not the moon, but dinner, that I can give." Her jaw tightened. "Don't toy with her. She already imagines enough to survive hunger. She doesn't need false promises from strangers, especially men like you." The rebuke hit him harder than a shareholder revolt, but he did not retreat. Instead, he unfolded the drawing again, staring at the crude lines until they blurred. "I'm not used to being asked for something so human," he admitted. For a long moment, Isabel said nothing. Then she sighed, exhausted, the fight in her dimming. "If you come as yourself, not as Jonathan Blake the savior. She doesn't need a savior. She needs stability." Jonathan nodded, though he wasn't sure he knew what that meant. Stability had never been his currency. That night back in Manhattan, Jonathan sat at the long dining table of his penthouse, the food untouched before him. He unfolded Emily's drawing and placed it where a plate should be. The sight of it, the three figures, the sunflower, stirred something in him. He poured wine but could not drink. Instead, he whispered aloud, "I promised." He realized the absurdity. A man who had reshaped industries now felt bound by the words spoken to a 6-year-old. But the absurdity did not diminish the weight. If anything, it made it heavier. He carried the drawing into his study, propped it against his monitors filled with reports. The colored crayon lines mocked the sterile graphs and charts. And yet, in some inexplicable way, they also completed them. Numbers measured profit. The drawing measured meaning. For hours, Jonathan sat there, imagining what it would be like. A table too small for grandeur, bowls steaming with simple soup, laughter spilling without agenda. A dinner not of power, but of presence. And then the fear came. His board, his investors, his reputation. If they ever knew he was spending time in a tenement with a seamstress and her child, worse, that he was letting their struggles alter his decisions, they would devour him. He could already hear their scorn. Sentiment is weakness. Compassion is poor strategy. Families are not part of EBITDA. A dangerous promise indeed. The next morning, Jonathan entered the skyscraper headquarters of Blake Holdings. The lobby's marble floor gleamed, reflecting his figure like a cold twin. Assistants greeted him with clipped efficiency. In the elevator, executives murmured about the upcoming board meeting. Jonathan kept silent. In his pocket, folded small, was Emily's drawing. He touched it once, as though to remind himself it was real. In the boardroom, surrounded by men and women in suits sharper than knives, he felt the familiar armor close around him. Financial reports projected onto the screen, voices droned about quarterly growth. But beneath the table, Jonathan's hand brushed the crayon paper, grounding him in a different reality. When the meeting ended, one of his directors pulled him aside. "Jonathan, you've been distracted. Everything all right?" Jonathan forced a smile. "Everything's fine." But it wasn't. That evening he returned again to the Riveras' apartment. Isabel looked wary but opened the door. Emily squealed with delight. "You came back! Did you bring your appetite?" Jonathan smiled, genuine and unguarded. "The biggest appetite." Emily climbed onto his lap, chattering about the menu for the upcoming dinner. Isabel busied herself at the counter, pretending not to listen. Jonathan watched them, and the realization struck him with both joy and terror. He belonged here more than in any boardroom. And yet, belonging came at a cost. He knew the board would not forgive his shifting focus, his sudden softness. Promises to children could topple empires when those children's mothers carried the weight of closed factories. Still, as Emily leaned against his chest and pointed at the drawing pinned to the wall, Jonathan felt the danger was worth it. He had made a promise, and for once in his life he would keep it, not for profit, not for power, but for the simple dignity of soup shared at a table. The boardroom at Blake Holdings had no softness. Its table stretched like a runway of polished oak. Its windows framed Manhattan's skyline in sharp steel and glass. This was Jonathan Blake's throne room, his battlefield, his sanctuary. Here he had outmaneuvered rivals, silenced critics, and turned fortunes into empires. But today, the room felt hostile. Directors filed in with leather briefcases and cold confidence. They were men and women in their 50s and 60s, veterans of markets, guardians of profit. Their voices hummed with impatience before the meeting even began. They sensed something was shifting in their leader, something dangerous to the fortress they had built around numbers. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, shoulders square, expression carved into neutrality. Yet inside, his pocket burned. Folded small, Emily's drawing pressed against his chest like a second heartbeat. He touched it once beneath the table, grounding himself. The CFO, a man named Harrington with eyes like coins, cleared his throat. "Gentlemen, ladies, before we move to projections, we must address an alarming rumor." A rustle of papers, a tightening of jaws. Jonathan felt the air thicken. "Word has reached us," Harrington continued, "that the CEO has been seen visiting a defunct textile plant in Boston, the very one we closed last quarter. And further, that he has been spending time in the home of a former employee." Gasps disguised as coughs. One director leaned forward. "Is it true?" Jonathan's jaw clenched. He could lie. He had lied before when it protected the company, but lying now would shatter what fragile dignity Emily and Isabel had given him. He raised his chin. "Yes, it's true." A ripple moved across the table, shock, then anger, then calculation. "Jonathan," Harrington said slowly, "you understand how this looks. Our CEO fraternizing with laid-off workers, spending time in squalid neighborhoods. The press catches even a whisper of this, and we are finished." "Finished?" Jonathan repeated, his voice colder than the glass skyline. "Or exposed." Another director, sharp-voiced Ms. Larkin, slammed her hand lightly on the table. "This is not about morality, it's about business. Investors trust us to pursue profit, not sentiment. Compassion is admirable in churches, not boardrooms." The words sliced him. Compassion, an intruder here. Yet he remembered Emily's words. "If you eat here, You won't be lonely. How obscene. That kindness was weakness among those who had more than enough. I propose, Harrington declared, that we reaffirm our commitment to efficiency. No reversals, no concessions, factories stay closed, cuts remain cuts. We cannot indulge every sob story from the rubble of our success. Jonathan's hand tightened around the edge of the table. He wanted to shout that Emily was not a sob story, that Isabel was not rubble, but rage would only make him reckless. He took a breath, let silence stretch, then spoke deliberately. Do you know what I saw? His voice was low but carried. A child opening a lunchbox with nothing inside but a note from her mother. An apology for hunger. That mother worked in the factory we closed. That child eats imaginary food because of our decisions. The board stiffened. No one interrupted. And you sit here, Jonathan continued, pretending numbers are separate from lives. But numbers are lives. Every digit has a face. Every profit line is drawn over someone's sacrifice. Larkin sneered. You're letting guilt cloud your judgment. Our duty is to shareholders, not children. Jonathan's eyes flared. And what happens when the world discovers the children we've starved to feed shareholders? What happens when headlines say Blake Holdings profits while first graders eat air? Investors flee from scandal faster than from recession. A heavy silence followed. They knew he was right. Public perception was currency. But Harrington recovered first. Then we bury it, he said curtly. We ensure no one ever hears about this girl or her mother. We pay off whoever we must. But Jonathan, you must stop these visits. Cut ties immediately. Jonathan felt the drawing in his pocket like a living thing. He remembered Emily's hopeful command, come back tomorrow. He could not betray it. No, he said quietly. The words struck like a gavel. No, Harrington echoed, incredulous. I will not abandon them, Jonathan said, his voice gaining strength. And I will not run this company as if profit exists apart from people. I intend to propose a restoration plan, jobs for the laid off, fair wages, and a school program ensuring no child faces an empty lunchbox again. The board erupted. Voices collided, outrage sparking like flint. Absurd! You'll ruin us! This is suicide! Jonathan let them rage. He had faced storms before, but never one powered by his own conscience. He waited until the noise thinned, then spoke again, calm but immovable. You can fight me. You can even try to replace me. But understand this, I built this empire. Without me, you are a table without legs. And I will not let this company destroy dignity for profit any longer. The room went still. His words had weight not only because of authority, but because, for the first time in years, they carried conviction. Real conviction, born not of strategy, but of truth. Harrington's face tightened like a fist. Be careful, Jonathan. Promises made to children may undo men. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes burning. Then let it undo me. I'd rather fall keeping a promise than stand on top of lies. The boardroom's shadows deepened, as if the building itself recognized the fracture. Jonathan knew he had just declared war against his own directors, against the machinery of profit, against the version of himself that had once signed papers without a second thought. And yet, for the first time in decades, he felt alive. When the meeting adjourned, no one shook his hand. The directors left in silence, their polished shoes clicking like hammers on stone. Jonathan remained seated, alone, the city sprawling beneath the windows. He unfolded Emily's drawing and placed it on the oak table. 3 figures, a sunflower, bowls of soup. A dangerous promise, yes, but also a compass. Jonathan touched the paper gently. I will keep it, he whispered. And in the heart of the boardroom where shadows had always ruled, a single fragile light began to grow. The night after the boardroom clash, Jonathan Blake found himself standing once more at the threshold of Isabel Rivera's apartment. The air outside was damp with Boston rain, the kind that soaked into brick walls and left a chill lingering in the bones. His chauffeur had begged him to reconsider. "Sir, this is not safe, not wise." But Jonathan had insisted on coming alone. He knocked, 3 raps echoing against peeling paint. The door opened cautiously. Isabel stood framed in the weak yellow light of a single bulb. Her eyes narrowed when she saw him, suspicion laced with fatigue. "You again." Jonathan inclined his head. "I said I'd come back." Emily's delighted squeal answered before her mother could. The little girl darted forward, pink lunchbox clutched like treasure. "You came! You really came!" She tugged him inside with the authority of a hostess welcoming her most important guest. The apartment smelled of boiled rice and something faintly herbal. Isabel had clearly tried to stretch little into enough. Jonathan sat at the rickety table while Emily bustled about, pouring invisible tea into plastic cups and announcing, "Tonight's special, soup and sunshine." Jonathan laughed softly, but Isabel did not. She crossed her arms, watching him with guarded intensity. Finally, she spoke. "Why are you here, Mr. Blake? Really?" Jonathan hesitated. He could tell her about the boardroom revolt, the accusations, the threats. He could confess how a child's drawing now dictated his decisions more than any market analysis. But the truth, stripped bare, was simpler. "Because I made a promise," he said. Isabel's eyes hardened. "You can buy promises. You can bury them. But you cannot walk in here and think we're a project for your redemption." Her words cut, sharper than Harrington's scorn. Jonathan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "I'm not here to redeem myself. I'm here because your daughter believes in me, and I can't live with myself if I betray that belief." Emily, oblivious to the tension, plopped into the chair beside him and slid the lunchbox across the table. "Dessert," she whispered. Inside was another drawing, this time of a house with smoke curling from the chimney, a garden of sunflowers, 3 figures holding hands. Jonathan's throat tightened. He glanced at Isabel. "She draws me into everything." Isabel's face softened briefly, but pride quickly reshaped it into steel. "Because she's a child. She doesn't know the kind of man you are." Jonathan flinched. Maybe she knows me better than anyone else ever has. The silence between them deepened. Emily began humming to herself, filling the void with a fragile melody. Finally, Isabel sat down, her shoulders slumping with exhaustion. "Do you know what dignity costs in this place, Mr. Blake? Every day I wake up and wonder how to feed her without selling the last of it. And now you arrive, offering, what, a seat at her imaginary restaurant? You think that fills the fridge?" Jonathan met her gaze without flinching. "I don't want to buy your dignity. I want to restore what was taken. My company closed that factory. I signed the papers. I am responsible, and I will change it." Isabel's jaw tightened. "You think you can undo years of hunger with one decision?" "No," Jonathan admitted quietly. "But I can start, and I will." For the first time, Isabel seemed uncertain. She looked at him not as a billionaire, but as a man wrestling with himself. Jonathan rose and paced the small room. "I stood in that boardroom today and told them things had to change. They laughed, they threatened, they called me insane. But for the first time in my life, I didn't care. I'd rather lose my empire than keep it built on empty lunchboxes." Isabel's eyes widened slightly. "You'd risk everything? For us?" Jonathan stopped pacing. "Not just for you. For every worker we discarded. For every child who eats air while we count profits. He paused, his voice cracking. But yes, also for you. Emily clapped her hands suddenly, delighted though she had not followed the conversation. So it's settled. You'll both come to my restaurant forever. Both adults turned toward her, startled, then met each other's eyes. Something unspoken passed between them, an acknowledgement of the impossible dream painted in crayon and innocence. Isabel's voice softened, almost breaking. You can't stay, Jonathan. Our worlds don't mix. One day she'll wake up and realize promises break. I'd rather she learns hunger than heartbreak. Jonathan sank back into his chair, weary. If I walk away, I break her heart now. If I stay, maybe I have a chance to prove not all promises end that way. The rain outside intensified, drumming against the window. The room felt smaller, heavier, caught between past wounds and future uncertainty. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. Inside him, two men wrestled, the CEO who calculated risks with ruthless precision, and the man who had eaten invisible spaghetti from a child's hands. For decades, the CEO had won. Tonight, the other man fought back. When he opened his eyes, he turned to Isabel. Tell me what you need. Her lips parted, surprised. She had expected excuses, not surrender. Slowly, she said, Work, not pity. A way to stand on my own feet again. Jonathan nodded. Then that's where I'll begin. Emily beamed, sliding her hand into his. See? I told you. Nobody's lonely at my restaurant. For a fleeting moment, the storm inside Jonathan quieted. He looked down at her small fingers gripping his, then up at Isabel's tired, wary eyes. Between them lay distrust, pain, and worlds of difference, but also the faint outline of something new. It was not peace, not yet, but it was a battle he was willing to fight. The storm broke inside Blake Holdings on a Thursday morning. Jonathan Blake entered the boardroom not as the careful strategist they had always known, but as a man carrying the weight of a promise. His directors were waiting, armored in tailored suits and sharpened contempt. The agenda was clear. Finalize new acquisitions, approve layoffs, trim excess costs. Jonathan sat at the head of the table, laid down his leather folder, and spoke before anyone else could. We are reversing course. The sentence cracked like a whip. Silence rippled across the long oak table. Reversing? Harrington, the CFO, repeated, his voice heavy with disbelief. Yes, Jonathan said, his tone deliberate. Effective immediately, we will reopen the Colfax textile plant in Boston. Former employees will be rehired with fair wages and improved conditions. Additionally, we will implement a program across every school our subsidiary serves. Free lunches for all children. No exceptions. The explosion came instantly. Voices collided, outrage filling the room. Madness. You'll bankrupt us. This is sentimental suicide. Jonathan let the storm rage. He had spent decades mastering silence, and now he used it as a weapon. When the noise ebbed, he rose. His presence filled the room. For years, he began, voice low but steady, we have measured success only in numbers. But numbers are not the full story. Behind every percentage point is a face. Behind every cut is a child opening an empty lunchbox. Several directors shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to look at him. I saw one, Jonathan continued, his throat tightening. Her name is Emily, 6 years old. Her mother lost her job because of our acquisition. That child now eats imaginary meals. That, he slammed his palm on the table, is the price of our efficiency. Larkin, the sharp-voiced director, leaned forward, eyes flashing. You cannot govern a corporation with pity. You'll drag us all into ruin." Jonathan met her gaze without flinching. "Better ruin with honor than profit with rot." Harrington's face darkened. "You're gambling with billions. Do you understand that shareholders will crucify us? That you'll lose your seat, your reputation?" Jonathan reached into his pocket and unfolded a small, crumpled sheet of paper. He placed it on the polished wood for all to see. A child's drawing, 3 figures around a table, bowls steaming, a sunflower in the center. "This," he said quietly, "is more valuable than your dividends." A stunned silence followed. No one dared touch the paper, yet every eye was drawn to it. "You want numbers?" Jonathan went on. "Here are mine. A reputation saved is worth more than a scandal buried. A workforce restored is worth more than a community abandoned. And a child fed is worth more than every line on every spreadsheet in this building." His words, weighted with conviction, landed like stones in water. Larkin scoffed. "You've lost your mind." "Perhaps," Jonathan admitted, his voice fierce now, "but I have found my soul, and I will not betray it again." The board erupted into whispers, hurried calculations, frantic looks. Jonathan could feel the fracture widening, loyalty cracking, power slipping. Yet for once, he felt no fear. "This is not a proposal," he declared. "It is a decision. You may fire me if you wish, but until that gavel falls, I am CEO, and this company will no longer feed on hunger." With that, he turned, leaving the drawing on the table like a gauntlet. The press conference was scheduled that afternoon. Journalists packed the hall, cameras flashing like lightning. Rumors had already spread. Blake Holdings reversing layoffs, Blake Holdings feeding children. No one believed it until they saw the man himself. Jonathan stepped onto the stage, the weight of his empire behind him. He adjusted the microphone. For once, his notes were blank. "Today," he began, voice echoing through the room, "we change direction. Too long have we defined profit as subtraction. Cutting jobs, cutting wages, cutting dignity. Today we choose addition, restoring work, restoring hope, restoring meals to the children who carry our future." He outlined the policy clearly. Colfax reopened, workers rehired, a nationwide initiative named Lunch for Every Kid. The cameras caught every word, every flicker of conviction. Reporters fired questions. What about investor backlash? What about costs? Is this philanthropy or strategy? Jonathan answered calmly. This is justice, and if justice costs me my fortune, so be it. Gasps rippled across the room. For once, a titan of finance had spoken not in percentages but in truths. That evening, headlines blazed across the nation. Jonathan Blake defies his own board, launches free lunches for children. Billionaire CEO chooses conscience over profit. Wall Street stunned, compassion in the boardroom. Stock prices trembled. Investors howled. Analysts called it reckless, idealistic, suicidal. But among ordinary people, something else stirred. Letters poured in, emails flooded his office. Teachers, parents, children. One line appeared again and again. Thank you. That night, Jonathan did not dine at his long, empty table. He returned instead to Isabel's apartment. Emily greeted him with a leap, brandishing the newspaper where his face filled the front page. You're famous, she cried, as if he hadn't already been. Did you tell them about me? Jonathan knelt, eyes glistening. Yes, Emily. I told them about you. Isabel stood behind her daughter, arms folded, expression unreadable. You've lit a fire you can't control, she said quietly. Jonathan nodded. I know, but some fires must burn. For the first time, her eyes softened. Just a little. And as Emily placed another crayon drawing in his hands, this one of a school cafeteria filled with children eating together, their laughter painted in bright arcs. Jonathan understood the truth. He had not only reversed a policy, he had reversed himself, and there was no going back. The cafeteria had never felt so alive. On a crisp Friday afternoon, sunlight poured through the tall windows of the elementary school, spilling across rows of plastic tables. Teachers hurried, children buzzed with restless anticipation, and trays clattered like cymbals in an orchestra warming up. But at the far end of the room, where once a 6-year-old girl had pretended to sip soup from empty air, a miracle was unfolding. Emily Rivera opened her pink lunchbox. For the first time in weeks, maybe months, it was not empty. Inside was a neatly wrapped sandwich, a carton of milk, an apple polished to a shine. To any other child, it would have been ordinary. To Emily, it was a banquet. She lifted the sandwich high above her head as though announcing a prize. "Today," she declared to the table of classmates, "my restaurant is open for real." The children leaned closer, eyes wide. Some giggled, others gasped. Emily carefully broke the sandwich in half, placed one piece on her friend's tray, then another on the tray of a boy who often teased her. She set the apple in the middle for everyone to share. "Soup and sunshine for everyone," she announced. Laughter and cheers erupted. What had begun as a child's imagination was becoming a feast. At the back of the room, Jonathan Blake watched. He stood with his hands clasped, a man more accustomed to marble boardrooms than sticky cafeteria floors. Yet here, amid the chatter of children, he felt a gravity he had never known in skyscrapers. Emily caught sight of him and waved vigorously. "Come sit," she called. And so he did. The plastic chair groaned under his weight as he joined the circle of children. Emily slid a portion of her sandwich toward him. "Customer," she said with a grin, "your order is ready." Jonathan picked up the half sandwich with the care one might reserve for fine china. He took a bite, chewed, and swallowed. "Delicious," he pronounced. The children burst into laughter. One boy leaned across the table, whispering loudly, "Isn't he the man from the news?" Another replied, "My mom said he's the crazy billionaire who gave free lunches." Jonathan smiled faintly. Crazy. Perhaps they were right. But as he watched Emily's face glow with pride, he knew he had never been saner. News of the program had spread quickly. Across Boston, cafeterias that once echoed with the silence of children pretending not to be hungry now hummed with new energy. Trays were full. No one was left out. Teachers whispered their thanks. Parents cried in relief. But here, in this cafeteria, it was personal. Jonathan leaned close to Emily. "You've done something remarkable," he said. Emily tilted her head. "Me?" "I just shared my lunch." Jonathan's throat tightened. Out of the mouths of children, the simplest truths came. She had done more than share her food. She had shared her dignity, her imagination, her courage. And he, a man who had once signed away jobs with a flick of a pen, was now following her lead. Across the room, Isabel stood quietly by the door. She had come to pick up her daughter, but lingered, watching. Her eyes softened at the sight of Emily laughing among friends, no longer pretending but truly eating. Then her gaze shifted to Jonathan. Their eyes met. She gave a small nod, neither approval nor forgiveness, but acknowledgement. It was enough. Later, as the cafeteria emptied, Jonathan remained at the table. Emily climbed into the chair beside him, swinging her legs. "Did you like the food?" she asked, serious as a businesswoman closing a deal. Jonathan smiled. "It was the best meal I've ever had." She considered this, then said, "You should come back tomorrow. We're having pizza day." Jonathan chuckled. "I wouldn't miss it." But inside, he felt the tremor of something greater. This was no longer about one lunchbox, one cafeteria. This was about rewriting the story of an empire. The policy had been announced, but its survival was not guaranteed. Investors were furious. The board was sharpening its knives. His future at Blake Holdings hung by a thread. And yet, none of that mattered as much as the small hand resting on his sleeve. Emily yawned, tired from excitement, and leaned against him. "Thank you," she whispered. Jonathan closed his eyes briefly. In that moment, the empty man who once dined alone at long tables was gone. Here sat someone new, a man who had discovered wealth not in numbers, but in the laughter of children sharing sandwiches. That night, Jonathan returned to Manhattan. He entered his penthouse, silent as always, but for the first time he did not feel crushed by the emptiness. He walked past the grand dining table without sitting, past the paintings he had bought without seeing. In his study, he unfolded Emily's newest drawing, a cafeteria filled with children, a long table of food, himself sitting in the middle. He pinned it above his desk, right where his eyes would fall before any financial chart. For decades, he had built his empire on the principle of subtraction. Subtract costs, subtract workers, subtract humanity. Now, guided by a 6-year-old with a pink lunchbox, he was learning the principle of addition. Add dignity, add laughter, add meals that turned strangers into family. As midnight spread across the city, Jonathan poured himself a glass of water, not wine, and raised it in a silent toast to the girl who had taught him more than any board ever could. "To Emily's restaurant," he murmured. And for the first time in years, he drank not to forget, but to remember. Months passed. Boston's winter surrendered to spring, and with it came changes no one could have predicted when a little girl first opened an empty lunchbox. At Colfax Textiles, the factory floor buzzed again with the rhythm of sewing machines. Isabel Rivera walked between rows of workers, not as a seamstress this time, but as a supervisor. She wore a badge clipped to her blouse, her dark hair tied neatly back. Her posture carried both pride and disbelief. For years, she had stitched until her fingers blistered. Now she guided others, ensuring fair hours, fair pay, dignity restored. The program Lunch for Every Kid had spread across schools in Boston. Cafeterias, once filled with silence, now brimmed with chatter and trays that never went empty. Teachers said children focused better. Parents said stress lifted. And newspapers began calling the initiative the Blake Reversal. Jonathan read those headlines from his Manhattan office, though he spent less and less time there. The skyscraper still bore his name, the empire still hummed, but something in him had shifted. He no longer measured success by quarterly reports. He measured it in drawings Emily pressed into his hands, in Isabel's cautious but growing trust, in the sound of children laughing over sandwiches and soup. On a soft April evening, Jonathan visited the Riveras' apartment again. The peeling paint remained, but Isabel had hung new curtains, and the shelves bore small touches of pride: potted plants, a framed certificate from the reopened factory. Emily greeted him with a whirlwind hug. She had grown bolder, her cheeks rounder now that hunger was no longer her shadow. "You're late," she teased, dragging him to the table. On the worn wooden surface sat bowls of real soup, steam curling into the air. Isabel ladled portions with the grace of someone who had endured scarcity and now cherished abundance. Jonathan sat, awkward at first. He had dined with presidents and tycoons, but here, in this cramped kitchen, his hands trembled slightly as he lifted the spoon. The soup was simple: lentils, carrots, broth, but it tasted like revelation. Emily watched him eagerly. "Well?" Jonathan smiled. "Better than anything I've ever had." She clapped her hands, triumphant. "I told you Mom makes the best soup." Isabel shook her head, but a small smile tugged at her lips. Don't flatter her too much, she said softly. She'll expect dessert. For a moment, laughter filled the room, genuine and warm. After dinner, Jonathan lingered as Emily colored on the floor. He turned to Isabel. You've built this back, stronger than before. She met his eyes. We've built it, she corrected. Then, after a pause, but I still don't understand you. Men like you don't change. Jonathan considered her words. He thought of the long nights alone in his penthouse, the echo of his footsteps across marble floors, the emptiness he had mistaken for power. He thought of Emily's voice declaring, If you eat here, you won't be lonely. Maybe I was never really a man like me, he said finally. Maybe I was just waiting for someone to remind me what mattered. Isabel studied him, skepticism softening into something else, something like reluctant respect. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan began spending more evenings in Boston than New York. At first, the board of Blake Holdings had raged, stock prices had dipped, investors had threatened revolt. But slowly the tide shifted, public support grew, consumers preferred companies with conscience. Analysts began calling his gamble visionary. What had seemed like madness became momentum. Jonathan still fought battles in glass towers, but each time he entered a boardroom, he carried Emily's drawings in his briefcase. They reminded him of the line he could never cross again. One Sunday afternoon, Emily tugged his sleeve. Are you my uncle? She asked suddenly. Jonathan blinked. Why do you ask? She shrugged, crayon in hand. Because you come for dinner. Because you keep your promises. Because Mom smiles more when you're here. The words hit him with a force greater than any market collapse. He looked at Isabel, who had overheard. Her cheeks flushed, but she did not correct her daughter. Jonathan knelt beside Emily. I'm not your uncle, he said gently, but I'll always be here, as long as you want me. Emily nodded, satisfied, and returned to her coloring. Jonathan sat back, shaken but strangely at peace. That night, as he walked Isabel to the door, she spoke quietly. You've given her more than food. You've given her hope. I don't know what this means for us, for you, for me, but... She hesitated, then finished. You've kept your promise. That's more than most men do. Jonathan swallowed hard. I intend to keep it for the rest of my life. Their eyes met, and though no words of love were spoken, something unspoken bloomed, a fragile, tentative seed of family. Months later, Emily's pink lunchbox sat on a shelf, no longer a vessel of emptiness, but a relic of survival. On the lid, faded sunflowers still stretched toward an unseen sun. Jonathan often looked at it and thought, this was the beginning. A box of nothing that revealed everything. He had once been an empty man. Now, because of a child's imagination and a mother's resilience, he was learning fullness, not of wealth, but of belonging. And so the story closed not in a boardroom or a mansion, but in a small kitchen where 3 people shared soup, laughter, and the fragile beginnings of a family no one had planned, but everyone needed. Jonathan Blake had once promised Emily, I'll come back tomorrow. And in the years that followed, tomorrow kept arriving, full, real, and true. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please subscribe, share, and join us for more. Every click helps these voices be heard.